Hey, I'm Jordan Jones, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Hugo Méndez, a scholar of early Christianity and associate professor in ancient Mediterranean religions at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, to explore what I think is a fascinating and often overlooked topic, the issue of forgery in the New Testament. Why does it matter if parts of the New Testament were forged? How can we know if something was forged? And how does this affect our understanding of the history of these texts? I also want to mention that Dr. Méndez is teaching a new online class all about the New Testament for the Biblical Studies Academy. It's called The New Testament, Exploring the Christian Bible, and it's available now. If you're looking to learn more about the New Testament, I can't recommend this class enough. The link is in the description. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about forgery in the New Testament. Dr. Méndez, thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us today for a topic that I think probably has raised the eyebrows of some people that saw the title here. We're talking about forgery in the New Testament. But before we can get into that, I want to ask you to define terms for us here, because this is a term that probably has some people's hackles up. So when we're talking about forgery, how do you understand forgery, define forgery? Is this outright lying? Is this intentional? Is this something different altogether?
Yeah. So when I talk about forgery specifically, I see it as a subtype of something broader, which is false authorship. This is when authors will present their works as being by people other than who they are. So, this could be done for all kinds of reasons. In a fictional work, you might tell a story from a different person's perspective. But in a fictional work, there's a very clear understanding between author and audience, a kind of implied contract that we all know what's happening here. The author is just doing this for a certain creative kind of context and practice. Forgery is when someone does this without that. They are essentially misdirecting, deceiving an audience. They're keeping the audience not privy to the actual activity, presenting a text as if it's written by someone else, but not letting the audience understand that that's the case, probably in the hopes that they'll receive it as a text written by someone else.
What are the ways that can take place? I mean, I think most people might immediately go to the idea of, if I look at my New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are called after the names. They may have been raised in tradition that those are the authors. Is that what we're talking about, or is that one option among a multiplicity of ways that this can take place?
Yeah, so, one thing to probably keep in mind at the beginning is that when we look at the New Testament, the Bible broadly, we think that the titles that are affixed to many of the books of the Bible were added later by scribes. When we look at titles like Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark or John, these are not the kinds of titles we expect for ancient literature. They make a lot of sense for a later scribe looking at multiple texts that look very similar to essentially be trying to categorize these. These are all Gospels, and these seem to be written by different people, and I may have traditions at hand that say this one's Matthew, this one's Mark. But that title's not one that we would ordinarily think is of a form that an author would have put on their own writing. So when we look at the New Testament, we're instead thinking about, what do the texts themselves say? Some texts are anonymous. Some texts outrightly say in their very first line, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, Peter, they'll name their authors. So we think that in these texts, there are examples of texts that are, for instance, presenting themselves overtly as by a certain author. So this is Peter, this is Paul, but they're not actually Peter or Paul. This is just a false authorial claim. So that's pseudonymity. You also have more implied, implicit ways that this could happen, where potentially an anonymous text then also gets analyzed essentially this way.
Could you list through some examples? If we're talking about New Testament here, Paul might be one that people have heard before. But if we're looking at the New Testament, what are the texts within the New Testament that scholars, be they some or all, look at with a question mark around who the author is?
Yeah. There's a wide diversity of scholars in our field. There are scholars that are on the more conservative end of the spectrum, ones that are on the more critical end of the spectrum. So the number of how many texts in the New Testament are implicated in this practice is going to differ, and it's going to be very sometimes idiosyncratic even. But I think it's fair to say that roughly 15 out of 27 texts have been in one way or another questioned seriously by major scholars or significant scholars in the field, right? So this would be the following. So among the Gospels, the Gospel of John is at least one that I've questioned, that several other people have questioned. Ismo Dunderberg, Harry Attridge, David Libo. There are lots of names that have questioned the authorial claims of John. The other Gospels are simply anonymous, so they're not quite problematic. You have the book of Acts in the New Testament. And Bart Ehrman, my colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, has published questions about the authorship of Acts. The place, though, where most biblical scholars who are on the critical side really see the problems is in the letters of the New Testament, which makes sense because letter writing in general seems to have been a significant place in antiquity where this problem seems to have been concentrated. Among the letters of Paul, we have about 13 letters that stick the name Paul right at the beginning. 6 of them are ones that scholars question the claims of. So Colossians, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are the 6 that we question. There's another letter in the New Testament that historically is attributed to Paul, the book of Hebrews, and Claire Rothschild has raised questions among other scholars about its authorial claims, suggesting that it too may represent a Pauline, falsely authored work. Another big place where this is concentrated are the Catholic epistles, so to speak. So these are the letters that are concentrated right towards the end of the Bible, right in front of the book of Revelation. So this is the letters specifically of James, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude. I have raised questions about specifically 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then, when you reach the very end of the New Testament, you have the book of Revelation, and there are scholars, a line of scholars that have at least raised some questions about Revelation. So that's kind of the span. And if you notice, that's actually a lot of the literature we're talking about.
It's a significant 15, especially if you're coming to this as a new thing. To suddenly hear 15 is a large number.
Yeah, so it raises all sorts of very interesting questions, right? Which is, for instance, how did we get them all in there? Why would that have happened? Where's the quality control problem?
Could you say a little bit about this term pseudepigraphy that people may be familiar with, a term that if they're reading biblical literature or scholarship on this, they might have heard before, classical literature. The difference here with what that is and how that comes into this conversation, if we're talking about these claims and pseudonymity and implied authorship, how these things line up next to each other or should be understood as different than each other?
Yeah. So some biblical scholars, most biblical scholars, prefer the name pseudepigraphy when they talk about this particular literature. Forgery in some ways can feel like a very charged term, right? It evokes contemporary ethics and concerns that might potentially seem anachronistic if you retroject them into antiquity. But pseudepigraphy is kind of a slippery term. It essentially means a lying epigraph, a lying title. It refers especially to when texts were misattributed or falsely attributed in antiquity. It's a term that comes to us from antiquity. I don't particularly like the term, partly because we know as scholars that pseudepigraphy is often used for 2 different kinds of things. It's used, on the one hand, for false authorship, for when an author might misrepresent themselves as a certain person. But it is also applied to instances in which later scribes took an anonymous text, let's say the Gospel of Mark, and decided to write, the wrong person's name at the top. Well, theoretically, that's a pseudepigraphon too. So because of that, because it involves false authorship and some other kinds of things like misattribution, it feels a little too slippery and too broad for me, which is why I kind of prefer more concrete language of false authorship, and then specifically subtypes like forgery.
So within that ancient context, then, I guess if you're looking at this from an audience perspective or that false authorship perspective, is this just very much a normal thing for the author to do that they wouldn't think anything of? Or is this an intentional decision where they are saying, yes, I want to do something specific here, and so I'm choosing to pick this up rather than going about this another way?
Yeah. So this is kind of that question of motivation, right?
Yeah.
Why does an author want to do this, and what does an author think they're doing when they do this? And this is one of the hardest things that any historian can try to tease out a little bit. I'm reminded of the quote by David Hackett Fisher, a historian from decades ago, who says that a person will do something for every reason he can think of and a few unthinkable reasons as well, right? That motivations are always pluralistic. You come into an activity, a project, with potentially several reasons for wanting to do it. Those are not only plural in number, they're plural in nature, right? You might have conscious and unconscious motives that will coexist, interact, and they're going to be fluid over the course of the project, over the course of your life, what you want to do and how you might be justifying what you're doing. In the case of a lot of the literature that we see in the classical world that seems to be participating in this, when classicists study that literature, they see motivations that look, just as varied as one can think of. Some people seem to be, misrepresenting the authorship of texts because they want to turn a profit. They want to sell a book that looks like it's by Galen. They want to produce a letter of Plato and sell it to the highest bidder, kind of a thing. There are some individuals who very clearly seem to be wanting to rewrite the memory of certain figures or enhance or augment or expand. So they might, go into the letters of, Diogenes, and they might be interested here in giving his, thoughts about a particular topic a particular turn that suits their own ideological interests.
Right.
We think that in some cases, people are engaged in this activity even out of spiritualities. Charles Stang has talked about spiritualities of self-effacement in the Pseudo-Dionysian corpus, where some authors might have wanted to write themselves out of their own literature as part of practices of humility or things like that. Giving credit to a founder is talked about in some classical texts with, for instance, the Pythagorean school. So it's kind of all over the board, right? So when it comes to the particular texts that we find in, for instance, the New Testament that might or might not be implicated in this particular practice, we kind of have to recognize one of these motivations might be at play. Frankly, two or three of them might be at play. Ones I haven't even mentioned, are probably also on the table. And it's kind of our job, as it always is as scholars, to try to shake out motives, agenda, and to figure out what's going on. And then let alone that larger question, right, of did the author feel an ethical compunction about this? Was it even an ethical question? If it was so widespread, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think that's an interesting clarification to make. If people are looking at this and saying, well, if it doesn't say at the top line, I, Paul, wrote this, then is it a forgery if it's being placed in this? How do you implicitly, explicitly, how do those things sift out in these texts?
Yeah, so there are subtypes of forgery. There are, obviously different varieties here. So one of them that's very familiar to us is pseudonymity, right? Making a pseudonymous text. This is when you slap at the front of a text, I, Paul, or when you if in a modern book would just put a false author's name right on the cover. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of, thing that you find all the time with, 19th century authors, for instance, pen names, right? Things like that. Although that is very familiar to us, it's not the only thing we find in antiquity. In part because, and you might know this, right, just opening the Bible, many biblical texts are roughly speaking, anonymous if you look at their contents. So some of them still will, construct an author on some level. All literary texts, to some degree, give us some sense about their author. So you might open up a text, you might see that it's written, for instance, in Greek. Well, you have already in your mind, you're beginning to build a mental image. This is a Greek author,
Right.
Greek-speaking author. Maybe they live in this region because they're talking about this region. This seems to be their background and influences. So even though they've never identified themselves around their text, you're slowly building a composite picture of them. In some cases, that composite picture can be a false one. So a great example from ancient Jewish literature is the Book of Wisdom, the Wisdom of Solomon. So this is a book that you'll find today in Catholic Bibles. As the title on the top, kind of gives you the impression, this was a book that presents itself as by Solomon. If you look at the text itself, the author never calls himself Solomon. Never once tries to expressly say that that's who he is. But if you look at chapter 9, and if you look at verses 7 to 8, the author will say, while praying to God, "You have chosen me to be king of your people and to be judge over your sons and daughters. You have given me a command to build the temple on your holy mountain." So as a reader, if you're looking at this particular verse, you're starting to think, okay, so whoever the author of this text is, whoever's speaking to me in this text, was a king over God's people who received a command to build his temple. This sounds like Solomon. And the rest of the text is all proverbial literature. And we know that Solomon is this very wise king, and he's associated with, for instance, the book of Proverbs. So you've already implicitly put together an authorial image that is specifically Solomon.
The reader or the hearer is the one in that context that's bringing that identification to it.
Yeah, that's right. But they're doing it from clues that the author seems to be leaving for them. So
Right.
like any other, anonymous text, you're kind of digging in and around the text trying to find the author. The author happens to leave little breadcrumbs for you that will point you in a certain direction to everyone except himself, or specifically to Solomon and not himself. So that's what implied authorship does. So Hebrews, for instance, could be that. The author never claims to be Paul. The author never, uses that name in there. The style doesn't feel very Pauline. But when you look at the end of the text, he talks about Timothy as a companion. He talks essentially about being in prison. And you start to think, well, this is very reminiscent of the flavor of Paul's letters, the circumstances, associates that we link with Paul. It could be Pauline. So I like that argument for Hebrews.
You've written some before in this place of implied authorship, talking about the Gospel of John, as you've written an article on this that I think is fascinating in the way that implied authorship happens here, because it takes place a little bit differently in the way that the eyewitness forgery method, I think is what you had called it there.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say how that is functioning in something like John that is maybe less specific with the tying it to names, but in the way that it places the person that draws the audience to make those conclusions again for themselves, but in a new way?
Yeah. Because we so often focus on pseudonymity as just, kind of study, people who study ancient literature, biblical scholars, we tend to miss these instances of implied authorship. And that's where I think there's more work to be done in the field of biblical studies. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is to take a look at one particular set of texts in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, the letters of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, and to note that, these texts are historically among the texts we put in something like the anonymous or near anonymous category. But when you look very closely at them, there are reasons for thinking that these could be false implied authorial modes. So there's always been a question a little bit among some scholars about John. So the Gospel of John doesn't name its author. But if you read the text from beginning to end, over the course of the narrative, you start to see this character who's called the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's this elusive, anonymous character. But then by the end of the text, right in 21, 24 to 25, you hear that this is the disciple who has written these things. And suddenly, you're supposed to, of course, put together at the end, oh, this was the author all along. Something that might already have been implicit in chapter 19, but really comes out in chapter 21.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with this character is that biblical scholars have for decades questioned his identity, his existence even. So, not only is it unclear who this person is, but if you look very closely, he's a very idealized character. He is present with Jesus at the Last Supper, leaning on his bosom, the way that Jesus is in the bosom of the Father, according to chapter 1 of the Gospel. He stays with Jesus when all the other disciples abandon him. He follows Jesus into his very interrogation, room or house. He stays with Jesus all the way to the cross. He's the one male disciple who will not leave Jesus' side. Jesus entrusts his mother to him because he is so faithful. And then on the morning of the resurrection, when he hears a report about an empty tomb, he sprints to the tomb. He beats Peter to the tomb.
He's faster. That's such a wonderful detail.
Faster. Yeah. He gets there first. And it says that when he walks into the tomb, unlike Peter, he believes. In chapter after chapter, he kind of has this completely idealized flavor. The other problem with this disciple is there's no clear mention of him in the other Gospels. So if you read the Gospel of Luke, women stand under the cross of Jesus. There are no male disciples there. If you look at the scene of the resurrection, Peter sprints to the tomb alone. There is no other disciple who's running with him. There is no other disciple who's running ahead of him, beating him there and believing before he arrives. So, it seems a little bit too perfect of an image that this one gospel would introduce this one character in all of these new places who has all the perfect responses to Jesus. It feels a bit like what I've kind of called the Forrest Gump effect, where Forrest—
That's a wonderful term for it.
In the movie is just getting inserted in all these scenes. Here he is shaking President Kennedy's hand. Here he is, doing all these kind of famous historical things. It's a character that seems to be inserted into the life of Jesus. And by the end of the book, this character, of course, is presented as the eyewitness author and guarantor of the entire book, when there is some legitimate question as to whether he even existed or not. So I would count that as a false authorial claim. The author of this text, what we think of as the last of the four Gospels, what frankly ancient Christians thought of as the last of the four Gospels, seems to have been engaged in a little bit of one-upmanship with the previous Gospels.
Does it coming last play a role in that eyewitness one-upmanship because it's attempting to compete with what came before it?
Yeah, we're always on very tentative ground with motivation, but I think so. I think that there's an established Gospel of Mark that people have been reading and copying and adapting, probably for decades now. There's a Gospel of Matthew, there's a Gospel of Luke that are both really substantial Gospels. But if you look at the beginning of Luke, Luke says that he's writing down what had been received from eyewitnesses. He's not an eyewitness himself. If you wanted to enter into this crowded, competitive field of Gospels, what might you do? Well, we know that a lot of second century Gospels get into this crowded field by claiming that they're written by eyewitnesses. This is the move of the Gospel of Thomas, which was definitely not written by the Apostle Thomas. This is the move of, a text like the Gospel of Peter, which is definitely not written by Peter. My argument has been, and the argument of others has been, that John may not be saying John inside the text or, necessarily, but it very much is telling you it was a disciple, it was an eyewitness, when there's every reason to think it wasn't. It's a falsely authored text.
Do the audiences, again, this is maybe a motivation style of question, but if you see this happening in so many different types of literature as an ancient audience member, is there an awareness, do you think, within that audience group that these things may not all be by either the claimed author or the implied author of the text, and there's a willingness to go along with that? Or do they seem to be unaware of what's happening in that authorial pool?
Yeah. At the very least, what we can say is at some point, lots of people are unaware and lots of people are disseminating this, right? Personally, I think that the texts that make it into our New Testament that are falsely authored probably fit into that forgery category, are probably written with some sort of deceptive, misdirecting notion. We know that, in certain ancient contexts, you might have a literary guild, a group of literate writers who enjoys the practice of writing in other people's names and sharing drafts with each other and doing this kind of thing. There's actually good historical evidence that some people are doing this activity just in open knowledge with one another in small groups. But for the text to achieve the kind of circulation they did, the reception history that they did, suggests that, very early on, if not, I think more likely at the very beginning, the author is doing something else. He's actually disseminating these texts precisely under the pretense that they are actually written by someone else. And he wants to misdirect the audience to think that. Another reason is that some of these texts plead hard for that authorship. This isn't just a kind of let's put a cute little name and cast on the text. This is text that, for instance, like 2 Thessalonians, one of the texts that we think was not written by Paul. 2 Thessalonians warns you against forgeries, even as it's a falsely authored text. It kind of seems to be really anxious, insecure about this. In the Apostolic Constitutions, this later, 4th century, collection of materials, you have the voices of the apostles pretending to condemn books written by them falsely. There are also, for instance, in the Gospel of John, these kind of constant attempts in little ways and big ways to get you to think about the claims of the book as authoritative. So when the author, for instance, in chapter 19, verse 35, says that the one who is testifying to these things and he tells the truth, that he tells the truth. It's kind of trying to press the question of, do you believe me or not, in ways that we think are going beyond simple play, entertainment, compositional practice. They're actively trying to recruit, if you will, true believers in the authorial claims they're making.
Interesting. How do these things get out? Because you mentioned here that the authors are potentially doing this for the purpose of disseminating these. How does that end up getting out once you have written this and you slap a false name on it or you imply different authorship? How do you get this into the community? Is there a process of testing this to see if we picked the right person to imply, or do we just kind of release it into the wild?
Another great reason to think that they're not doing this with the open consent of everyone, that everyone doesn't understand what they're doing, is that we don't have good information on even how they release these things in the wild, right? There is no record of, and such created that very delightful letter of 2 Thessalonians for the rest of us. The reality is we don't know a lot about how this literature got out there, because just as you're going to efface the author, you're going to efface the author's methods, the real author's processes for getting this literature out there. Our best guess from the very limited clues that we have is that these texts followed the same routes to publication that, frankly, all ancient texts probably followed. So there is no publication, strictly speaking, in the ancient world, right? This isn't something like you take it to a press, they print off 100,000 copies, and there's a copyright and an ISBN number and a Library of Congress entry for each of these. What publication looks like in the ancient world is you've been working on a manuscript, and then you take that and you hand that to someone else, or you leave it somewhere for someone to pick it up. So this can happen in a few ways. We know that in some ancient contexts, individuals are publishing by correspondence. They finish their manuscript and they decide to ask a courier, a messenger, probably an enslaved person, to take this particular text and walk it over to that city. Take a boat to that city, whatever the case may be, and hand it to such and such person. Probably someone with the means to copy that text. This is the way that normal texts are often published. Send them to people with the resources to copy them and disseminate them broadly, the influence to get lots of people to read them. It's probably also the way that a lot of these falsely authored texts came out.
Mhm.
We, in our very few examples of ancient literature that discuss this, we have the letter of Salvian to Salonius, Epistle 9 of Salvian, where it seems to be describing a situation in which Salvian, this particular monk, has been trying to get this text that's written under the name Timothy out into the world. And what he's done is he has sent it to a former pupil of his who's now a bishop, influential, able to command the resources to make copies of a text, named Salonius. It seems that, as he says at the end of the letter, he wants Salonius to make copies of this text. The problem is that Salonius fished out, this was not written by a Timothy. This actually sounds like it was written by Salvian. And, he apparently fired back some letter earlier that tells Salvian, I can't accept this. You're going to have to explain where this name comes from. This isn't appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. You're not supposed to be writing under this name. Without potentially even accusing him directly, he did something to cast suspicion on this and to kind of rile up Salvian into what becomes a very defensive letter back, in which Salvian comes up with 9 excuses for why it's okay to do this. And how he should still be willing to copy and send this thing out. So that's a very small fragment. It comes from, late antiquity, but it gives you an impression of the kinds of roads that certain people are using. They're using connections, probably connections in other cities where, the person might not have seen them composing the text, and they send the text that way so they can release them. In other instances, though, it's possible that authors are simply planting these texts. They might be entering an ancient library, an ancient literary collection. Christian churches would keep collections of texts for liturgical ritual reasons, right? Gospels that they're going to read. It's possible that they're just slipping texts in on the shelf on the wall. We know that many of these texts must have emerged by simply interpolating manuscripts. So there are, for instance, in classical antiquity, these large letter collections. You'll see dozens of letters by the same author. And when classicists look closely at the letters, they'll see that they're written by different hands in different stages of composition, it seems. So it seems that somebody took a core here, added a few more. Someone else added a few more. And so they're planting it in places where readers will eventually stumble upon them. So there are probably lots of different ways that one could imagine doing this. But again, we usually don't get specifically how this text ended up being released. Yeah.
And that is so fascinating, the example that they're not all on the same page necessarily about doing this either, that you have the creator of that false text saying, here are the reasons why you should still go ahead with this, being rebuked by the other. That's a fascinating example into the politicking of some of trying to get this stuff out.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's the part that, because we don't see it, we end up probably simplifying these processes too far. There's a common assumption among many scholars who work in antiquity that because this literature is so widespread, it must have been very broadly accepted, that, it was just, or even understood, or even perceived, that everyone's, aware and even celebrating the latest text that flies off the shelf and, like this. And I'm very skeptical of that. I think that, for the most part, what's probably happening are all these kinds of complex negotiations, like you said, politicking, all of this kind of working with what was probably early doubts, contestation, wrestling, and actually, campaigning to get these texts a hearing more broadly. So the authors are probably being very careful, very guarded about revealing themselves, but they are doing certain things to get the text out there. So in the case of Salvian and Salonius, Salvian knows what he's doing. Salonius suspects what he's doing, and is pushing back and getting pushed back. The next reader who gets this text might not have even been privy to any of this, right? Doesn't know Salvian, doesn't know his writing style, can't even begin to have the same doubts that Salonius would have in this instance. I think similarly, that's probably happening with Enochian literature, with some of these, falsely authored letters of Paul, that, this literature has landed in the laps of people. And I think this is the hard thing to understand. In antiquity, people don't have the resources to fact check.
Yeah.
So let's begin. Like I tell my students, right? If you think about just pseudonymity, the moment you put a name on a book, you have forever shifted the burden of proof onto the reader to disprove that. It says it's written by Paul. So what do you have against that claim?
Right. And you have to have something to strike it down.
That's right. So, so that's the burden of proof. The problem is you're in a society with widespread illiteracy. You're in a society with people located so far apart from one another, kind of very strained networks of communication. There's no central internet. You can look up the history of how this thing first popped up and trace its, how it became viral the way we might with like a tweet today or something like that. Odds are when you first encounter a text, you don't actually know the chain of custody on how it got to you. You don't know enough about writing style and comparisons to be able to definitively place it with a person. And if the text keeps broadcasting, it's by someone, that person has already pushed the football over the 50-yard line. They're already threatening to get the thing all the way through.
In that too, what kind of expectation should we have for the number of texts that if someone is even able to do a comparison, how many things, if you're looking at the letters of Paul, for example, or the claimed letters of Paul, how many should we expect somebody to have that they can say, let's put some on the table and see whether this matches up? Would they have that at all? Might they just have one? Or is it going to be a very limited number? Would they have all of them?
Yeah, this is the question of how Paul's letters circulated, were collected, right? At what point did people have multiple letters of Paul to reference against for precisely this activity? And how did it look? And, I'll say this, maybe to that point indirectly. Today, biblical scholars of antiquity, but biblical scholars in particular, when they're arguing about things like the letters of Paul, many of them want to get into stylometric analysis. They want to look at the linguistic features, the linguistic fingerprint of Paul in his own letters. The problem is, if we have 7 letters that are genuine, we think, I think reasonably, 7 letters, that's not a large sample size. If you could take everything that I've ever written, obviously aspects of my linguistic style have changed over my lifetime. Obviously, there are ways in which I might speak in different registers, code switch for different audiences, different, registers of formality or informality. It's very easy in biblical studies to take any stylometric analysis of this is what Paul's writing style was. And I will put this in a computer and show that this letter is not like Paul's style in these 7 letters, and at least to question, well, how large was your sample size? How confident can we really be when we have so little of Paul left? And if it's hard for us as modern contemporary people to do that, computing all of this quantitatively, driving up all this data, what are you doing in antiquity? You don't have that. Yeah, it's hard.
I think some people are probably naturally asking the question of, so what? If it wasn't written by who it says it was, but it was accepted by an ancient community as authoritative, does that question of implied authorship, false authorship matter so much? Should we focus on why it is received? How does this need to open up questions for modern readers, believers or non-believers coming to these texts? How does this still matter for them, even if it was accepted as authoritative in some way?
Yeah, it certainly depends on what you need these texts to do for you and what you expect of these texts, right? For modern scholars, it matters who wrote these texts for all the kinds of just fundamental things that we have to do as historians, right? If you're going to study an ancient text, you need to be able to roughly situate it in time. You need to be able to think at least on some level about who might have written this. And this obviously muddies a lot of that picture for us. And so this is the reason why we have to spend at least some time. No matter what our analysis of this text is, we have to be able to at least think about authorial claims. For believers, it depends. I tell people, I ask my students this often in the classroom. So who wrote First Kings? And none of them can tell me. I can't tell them who wrote First Kings. And so I kind of throw that out there to mean, well, how vital was that question to you? Now, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? And why is that question so much more vital to you? It might be vital, for instance, if you need it to, for instance, potentially be someone who knew Jesus directly. Maybe that's important. Except this clearly, according to tradition, wasn't necessarily true of Luke. Okay. Mm-hmm. If it's a letter of Paul and it's supposed to be by Paul, but it's not by Paul, does that matter more because he actually says it in the text? And therefore, that's perhaps going against notions of biblical infallibility and errancy, something where if it says it in the text, it must be true with a capital T, with a historical truth, everything around it, scientific truth. And that's going to differ by Christian tradition, right? Southern Baptists will have very different takes on this than Catholics, than Episcopalians. There's questions to ask.
It's such a difficult thing, I think, to start to grapple with if you're coming to this for the first time. Because as you know, there is a wide difference in feeling between, Kings and Matthew or Deuteronomy, even some of these texts in the Hebrew Bible that you go, oh, Moses is attributed as the author of these texts. But people still hold that a little looser, that they're more comfortable, whether because of the distance or their feeling about it, they're comfortable holding that claim of authorship more loosely than when they come to something in the New Testament that does make this conversation so emotional immediately as soon as you start to turn to this thing. And for someone who maybe is interested, but they're saying, I want to learn more about this. I'm interested in these kinds of things. I'm not at a university. I don't have the ability to do that. I want to give some time here because you're doing something right now that I think they might be very interested in. You're teaching a new online class. Could you say a little bit about the class, the nature of the class, and for people who might be interested in learning more, what they could expect to see there?
So this spring, I'm teaching a new class through the Biblical Studies Academy, which is a new initiative through the Bart Ehrman blog and podcast media world. So what I'm doing is I'm teaching a 27-lesson course introducing the New Testament. This is the exact course, roughly, that I teach my university students. It's the PowerPoints, it's the lectures. In a university setting, I get to break down all these questions of how do we think about authorship and date and false authorship. And this is a question for large parts of the New Testament. This is a course where I'll be exploring all of that for an online audience. It's a really exciting opportunity. There are 50-minute lectures, and then at the end, there's Q&A where students can, if you join the class live, actually experience, direct questions with the professor. So it's this incredible opportunity for people to step into my classroom, to actually have the chance to wrestle a bit with these questions on an academic level that they might not be able to in other sorts of settings or through other kinds of online programs.
I think that sounds wonderful. I mean, this type of material is interesting. It's so fascinating, not just to us. I mean, we're maybe a little bit biased because this is what we like to do with our time. But there are so many people that do want to have access to this because I do think something like this concept of forgery, the implications that this has, it's so important for our understanding of this text. Again, whether you come to this from a position of faith or not, because of the influence that these texts, that these claims have had over time. If there's one line that you would leave with someone that coming away from all of this, if their head is reeling, if they're thinking this has been a lot to take in with claims of authorship and implied authorship and pseudonymity and eyewitness accounts, I'm at a loss here. What would be that, the elevator pitch that they should say, this is what I need to know to get started again in thinking about claims of authorship in the New Testament? What's that essential one-liner for them?
I think that when we develop our concept of what the Bible is, what Scripture is, if we receive it as Scripture, we need to start from the texts themselves, right? And this is more than just quote a 2 Timothy 3:16. This is, what are these texts, and how does that shape our notions of inspiration, of sacredness, of inerrancy, all these kinds of questions that surround the biblical text. If your notion of inspiration has never grappled with the fact that false authorship is so widely represented in this literature, if that's just not altering how you're thinking about this, I would strongly recommend you have to start all over again. You have to begin with the base ground. If you think about a collection where something like 15 out of 27 texts are dubious from a perspective of authorship, that means you kind of have to begin to think about, what does authorship mean? What do the claims of these texts mean? How do we see them as part of a different picture? And I think that's the religious work of religious communities, religious ministers, religious believers on some level. But I think that there's no way to talk about the New Testament without centering, foregrounding precisely this problem.
And then one last one. This is a personal one for you. Do you have a favorite forged text, book, verse, line, or implied author? Do you have a favorite that you say, this isn't by who they say it is, but I like it anyways?
Oh, yeah. All of them. All of them. So this is the thing, right? The fact that these texts have false authors, this is not a reason to write them off. In fact, this is what makes them so compelling and interesting. We have the letters by Paul. We love the letters by Paul. In the letters that are not by Paul, we get to see different voices that we might not ever have heard before, with different perspectives. We think in some cases that individuals are involved in false authorship, possibly because they had no other way of getting their work out there. So Canada Moss has done really good work on this. My friend Jeremiah Coogan, who note that potentially, if you're a writer who was enslaved, nobody may want to read the works of an enslaved author, the theology of an enslaved author. But if you write it under the name of a great apostle, it gets your name and your voice and your ideas and your unique intellectual synthesis out there. In the 19th century, people turned to pen names. Women turned to pen names because it was their only path into the publishing market. This is like George Eliot, right? So this is something where I think what makes these texts so fascinating is that they bring us into corners and areas of ancient Christianity we just would not get otherwise. I work in the Gospel and Letters of John. I'm a Johannine scholar. And I think all 4 texts are falsely authored. I don't think they're by John, the son of Zebedee, as tradition says. And that makes them fantastic, because what then they really represent are, in my opinion, 4 different authors from 4 different contexts with, in many ways, 4 different interventions and agendas at play. It brings you into so many different corners of the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity.
I think that's a wonderful landing point. Dr. Méndez, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through this complicated topic today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Until next time.